Hello and welcome to the site of this week's Artist Diaries. If you've watched Artist Diaries before, then you might recognise this place because I have already done 2 videos from this location. It's just one of those places that it's nice to come back to. I feel like there's always something else for you to see. The landscapes here are pretty epic and the wildlife is lovely. I really like that you kind of feel you're in the middle of nature when you're here because the paths go through the reed beds and across the lakes. You feel like you're a part of the scene rather than on the sidelines looking in. I actually decided within about 5 minutes what I was going to paint for this week's video. As soon as I arrived, I just stumbled across the scene and I thought, yep, that's it. And I took loads of pictures and I took some video footage, which I'll share with you in a moment. But the good thing about making that decision early on is that it took the pressure off. And although I still kept an eye open, because you never know, something else might have turned up instead, it felt good to just wander around and enjoy the nature reserve without worrying about trying to find something to paint. It was nice to see gorse, which is becoming like the traditional Artist Diaries plant because they seem to be finding it all over at the moment. But besides that, I didn't really spend a lot of time looking at plants. I was mostly noticing the ducks on the water and other bird life. There were potsherds and goldeneye and mallards and coots and moorhens. There were shoveler ducks that swam past. There were tufted ducks, which came pretty close. Canada geese, which were ridiculously noisy. And I saw some lovely crows that were calling as well. Not all of the birds were easy to see, but there were Marsh Harriers there too and some Stonechats. And I know I've been saying this for years now, but one day I really ought to get a camera so that you can see all of this wildlife in just as much detail. So now we've had a nice brief tour of the site, we can get down to talking about the painting. I was looking back through some of my old video footage from the times when I visited this site before, and the place that I ended up painting is a place that I have filmed on each occasion, and on at least one of those occasions it was a contender for what I might have painted, so I feel like I've been drawn to this spot for years, and now it was time to actually paint it. This was the scene that I settled on, and there was just something about it. The golden reeds, the dark blue skies, the clear reflections, the glassy water, the way it's set up, everything about it just drew me in, and I knew as soon as I saw it, it would make a good painting. I also liked that the tufted ducks were nearby because that also inspired me as to what might else go in that painting, but the scene itself was what drew me in, that colour and the reflection, it's lovely. Here are a few clips from when I saw it in 2023. This is from late October, and then the next one is from early October, so you can see just how much it changed. And you can also see that I have been inspired by this place for years, even though I've never actually done anything about it. I think maybe I was waiting for the reeds to be a bit more golden. I think that definitely makes this painting stand out a bit more than if I'd have done it at a different time of year. And also there was a bit more of a gap this time, so it was easier to see how the composition would work, so perhaps that's why it just clicked this time round. Either way, I decided that would be the painting subject of the day, so here we are. I am working on 6x8 inch oil painting paper, which is cut to size, and I've started as usual by doing an outline in burnt sienna. Once that's all in place, then I go over with a very loose blocking just to establish where I want the main bits of colour to be, and then I just get painting. I was quite excited to do this painting, so I just threw myself into it rather than have much of a plan beforehand, but to be honest, that is usually the way it goes with these kind of paintings. I treat these paintings as studies, so they're kind of supposed to be spontaneous rather than planned out meticulously. I think different artists probably have different definitions of what a study is. I guess a study can be something that's a lot looser than this, which just gives you a rough idea of how you might lay a painting out. Or they could be more specific. They could be color studies or value studies to help you figure something out for a larger painting. I class these Artist Diaries paintings as studies because they're a little on the small side and they don't take a huge amount of time to do. The idea is to keep them fairly loose and not get too wrapped up in detail. And I also try not to worry so much if I make mistakes with them because they're not supposed to be a perfect painting. I use these to try out new ideas and to practice different techniques without worrying about ruining a more expensive, larger canvas. The thing that I like about doing studies like this is that these are finished paintings in their own right, and although they are a little bit looser and they're not as detailed as I might otherwise do, they still stand alone and they're not just a means to an end. These paintings are not just small studies that are all going to turn into larger finished paintings when I have the time to revisit them. Some of these will just remain as these tiny studies and they are an enjoyable thing to paint all by themselves. But despite the fact that I'm not going to use each one of these as the inspiration for a large finished painting, they're all still equally important and I still get a lot of use out of doing studies like this. I really think doing studies like this is a great way to learn as an artist and to improve your skill over time. I know that I learn a lot more from doing this than I do when I'm working on more complete paintings or slightly more detailed, larger paintings. When I work on something more complex, I feel like I've got to stick to more of a plan. I don't really allow myself to be as creative as I want to with the painting just in case I make a mistake. It kind of feels like the stakes are higher, either because it's a commission and there's a deadline, or the equipment's a lot more expensive. So I don't want to make a mess of it and have to restart it or get a new canvas. And so I tend to play those paintings safe and I'm more methodical with them. I'm less inclined to try new techniques, and I tend to stick with what I know for those kind of paintings. So, the reason I enjoy studies and the reason I think I learn a lot more when I'm doing these studies is that it's kind of the opposite. I paint much more spontaneously, and I feel like I'm being more creative when I do these studies. I definitely feel like I'm being a bit more of an artist, that I'm just trying out new things and getting lost in the painting, seeing what works and what doesn't. I don't worry so much if I make mistakes or put some paint down that just doesn't work. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I know that in about a week's time, I'll be doing another one of these. And so if this doesn't turn out great, then that's fine. I will learn from it and I will try and improve my next attempt. And that's what these are all about. They're just a chance to try out some new things and get lost in a painting and see what comes of it. And hopefully, I will learn something helpful, and that will help inform those more complex pieces that need a little bit more thinking behind them. I think one of the benefits of doing studies like this is that you can do more of them than you can those big complex paintings that might take weeks or months to finish. I always feel like I learn something at the end of a painting when I try and figure out what worked and what didn't. And so the more paintings I can work on and the more I get to finish, the more opportunity I have to learn. But I think there's an additional step when it comes to painting studies that really helps if you want to try and learn the most from them. And for me, that involves taking the time to analyze them when I'm finished rather than just putting them to one side and moving on to the next thing. I still think that that's useful. I think through repeated practice, you can learn things and you're picking stuff up all the time. But for me, I feel like I learn a lot more when I really take the time to look at what worked well in the painting and what didn't, and try to figure out why so that I can actually make the most of that in future paintings. That's definitely something that is easier said than done sometimes, especially when you're just beginning. I know when I first started, sometimes I would look at a painting when it was finished and I could tell that there was something not quite right, but I couldn't exactly put my finger on it. And then as I progressed and I learned a little bit more about painting, I'd be able to say what was wrong about the painting. Something looked a bit off and I could pinpoint what it was, but I couldn't figure out what I needed to do to fix it. I think being able to evaluate your work is a skill kind of like painting in that you get better at it the more you do it. And that has been the case with me. There's still some things that I would probably struggle to figure out, but I do feel like I have a better understanding of what works in my paintings and what doesn't and why than I did when I first started. And I think the only thing that's really changed is I have practiced a lot more, I've gained some more experience, and I've studied things. If I have made a bit of a mess of a painting, then I might watch a video on how to fix that particular issue, or I might study that area of painting to try and improve it next time. And so over the years, I feel like I've built up a little bit more of a knowledge of what to do with my paintings when they're going wrong, and so I find it's a little bit easier to try and analyze them at the end. I like to, if I can, come up with a fairly even number of points, both good and bad, about the painting so that I'm not being too biased and that I am reviewing it properly. And that is easier said than done sometimes. If I don't really like a painting, it is hard to pick a lot of things that I like about it. But I do think it's worth doing. I think it helps me to look at the painting properly and really try to analyze it effectively. So for this painting, for example, there were some areas that I thought could be improved. There is a section in the background just below that dark horizon line underneath the clouds where there's quite a light colour in the distance, and I really wanted that to pop and be a really warm toned highlight. But as I was painting it, I found that it was really difficult to make it stand out, and it took me a while to figure out why, but I think it is because I made the rest of the background a little bit too similar in tone and value, so when it came to adding those warm highlights, they just didn't really stand out. The rest of the painting looked too similar, and so it didn't really have the effect that I wanted it to. And this is kind of a similar point, but the colour of the hill on the right hand side in the background is pretty similar to the reeds in the middle distance. So it doesn't look as if it's as set back as it should be. I think I should have made that a little bit cooler and a little bit darker so it looked as if it was further in the distance. And that in turn would have also helped with the warm highlighted area because that would have stood out in comparison to that as well. A third area for improvement was that section on the left that's a little bit blurry. I knew I was going to put reeds over the top of this section, so I was a bit lazy with it and I didn't really bother to finish it off properly. But when it came to putting the reeds over the top, they didn't cover it as well as I thought they might, and so that whole area just looks a little bit unfinished. But that is exactly the point of studies like this. It's so I can make these mistakes at a smaller scale where they don't really cause too much of a problem, and I can then make a note of them so I can avoid them in future. I know that if I do a larger painting of a similar subject, that I should pay a bit more attention to color theory, perhaps maybe think about what colors I'm going to use before I just start throwing anything on there. And I should also make sure that I finish the background properly and not rely on my foreground material to cover up unfinished areas. And to even things out, I'm going to cover three things that I liked about the painting as well, because I think looking for good points is just as important, can give you useful pointers as to what you might want to include in a future painting. And for me, with this painting, what I really liked was the fence post. I put a really bright yellow and white highlight on there, and I think that really made it stand out from the background. So I'm going to try and remember that for the future. I also like the colour that I added into the section of rain at the bottom of the clouds in the distance. I added a little bit more blue, which stands out a bit more in person, I think, than it does in video, but it made a lot of difference, so I'm going to remember that tip for future. And I also thought the reflections turned out pretty well. I liked that I made them darker than what you could see above the water, and that reflected what was happening in real life, so I think those turned out pretty successful too. Thank you for listening to me ramble. I feel like I've maybe got a bit off track in part of this discussion, but I hope you enjoyed the video anyway and that you like seeing the wildlife and the painting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.